Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Johnson. This is short-term counseling, module 3. In this module, I'm going to be looking at the REBT theory of emotions. I will make some references to CBT, but largely REBT. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to focus largely on anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, and hurt. Those are going to be the major emotions that clients will be presenting with. Now remember the ABC model. The A will be the activating event, and we want to get the critical activating event, that particular part of the event about which the client was most disturbed. In addition to that, we need to analyze the emotions and behaviors. And then, of course, we will then go to identifying the beliefs that actually, to a large degree, contributed to or directly caused those dysfunctional emotions and behaviors. In this recording, I will be focusing largely on the C, and within the C, I will be focusing largely on the emotions, but I will also look at those action potential or behavioral potentials that are associated with these emotions, and I will make reference to the irrational or dysfunctional beliefs, although I won't spend much time on the beliefs since that will be a subsequent lecture. So let's begin with anxiety. And when we're talking about anxiety, we are talking about two different forms of anxiety: ego anxiety and discomfort anxiety. Ego anxiety is really arises out of an irrational or unhelpful belief that somehow there are threats to the individual's self-worth or even to the individual's being. Which often is, so most clients will identify that one with fear, but it's also ego anxiety. So there is an attribution about something in the world. The attribution is that that event or whatever is a threat to our self-worth or to our very being. And then we would, the result is anxiety, but this particular form of anxiety we would call ego anxiety. In distinction to ego anxiety, there is another form called discomfort anxiety. This is where there is an attribution of threat, but it's not to life or not to self-worth, but a threat to our individual level of personal comfort. Now, if I take COVID-19 as an example, there are many people who, of course, would make an attribution that COVID-19 is a threat, not necessarily to their self-worth, but to their very being. And so they would experience ego anxiety if certain unhelpful beliefs are in place. Normal, but particular if they have inordinate anxiety, unhelpful beliefs. Whereas associated with COVID-19, there can be discomfort anxiety. Again, there's an attribution of threat, but the threat is not to life or meaning. The threat is to comfort. So many people, particularly in the beginning, when they would go to the grocery store and they would not find paper products or cleaning products there, experience some anxiety about that. Well, that's not a threat to life, but it is a threat to their comfort. And so we would call that discomfort anxiety. When we look at analyze anxiety, notice there is initially an attribution of threat, which can be instantaneous. And then there are inferences and beliefs. Now, I've made the distinction about inferences and belief, but I'm going to make that distinction numerous times because students sometimes struggle with that. Well, not only students, there are some therapists that struggle with this. An inference, both of these are cognitions or types of thought. The difference is that an inference is a cognition or thought that is an interpretation of perceived reality, or we would say it is the meaning that is attributed to the state of affairs. So inferences are true or false. They're not up for grabs there in terms of truth value. They're true or false, although it may be difficult to discern that at times. And they're always an interpretation of a perceived reality. Beliefs are quite different. Their beliefs are also thoughts or cognitions, but these largely follow upon an inference. So an inference usually is in place, and then an individual has a belief associated with that interpretation. But the belief is not true or false. The belief is an attribution of value, goodness, badness, right, wrong. Those kinds of cognitions have to do with belief, and those are not true or false. They're just evaluations, and people evaluate things quite differently. So in the case of anxiety, there's an inference or an interpretation that threat to my individual domain, that threat is there. So that's an interpretation. And that the threat refers to some future event or the implication of a current event. So, for example, a threat, the COVID-19 would be a threat, and COVID is present now, but the threat really is about the consequences to health, to me or to whoever is experiencing the anxiety, the consequences in the future, not immediate. Nobody thinks they get COVID and die right in that second. So it is always about the future. The belief would be some evaluative one, like this threat shouldn't occur. So often we will see some kind of demandingness there: shoulds, oughts, must, have tos, needs, or must. So that it should not be there, and that if it does, if what is kind of predicted or worried about or projected, if it does occur, that would be terrible, horrible, awful, that kind of thing. Okay, so those two things, the inferences and the beliefs, have to be present for anxiety to be present. Now, not only there are inferences and beliefs, but the emotion itself is associated with what we might call an action or a behavioral tendency. So that if you have this emotion, particularly anxiety now, then we could kind of infer that there will be certain kinds of actions and behaviors here. Now, the value of this whole model of an emotion is that once we discern what the emotion is, we as therapists can form hypotheses. Don't assume that you know for certain, but you can form a hypothesis about what the inference is that the individual is making, the beliefs they have, and we may be able to make some predictions about how this individual will act. So this is a theory-driven model, but again, these are hypotheses. When we see the client, so we do not assume for certain that the individual has these, because there may be a mix of anxiety, other emotions. The individual may have mislabeled the emotion, any number of things. So the action potential or behavioral tendency with anxiety is to avoid or to withdraw from the perceived threat. So we see a threat, and then we want to avoid it. So, for example, some of this is quite rational, right? COVID, perceive it as a threat, some people perceive it as a threat, others, aren't thinking properly and don't see it as a threat. But if someone rightly perceives this as a threat, and the tendency would be to withdraw or avoid that, right? Kind of a rational individual. There would also be a tendency that for the individual to engage in some behavior that would give them symptomatic relief from the anxiety in the short run, okay? Some of that can be healthy, but a lot of that will be unhealthy. And so that's why we need to get on anxiety and be very serious when we're treating it. Often an individual with this kind of anxiety might have trouble with self-discipline, say discomfort anxiety. A lot of students will have this. It's not comfortable to have to study for exam and do all the reading that your unreasonable professors want you to do. And so instead of engaging in that and having to face that discomfort of having to study and all of that kind of stuff, you procrastinate, or in the extreme, some people avoid by using drugs. That's a bit extreme and really deleterious to health, but it is a possibility. Or they kind of, a lot of people engage in kind of magical thinking with anxiety, that they engage in behaviors or thoughts that can ward off the threat. Like, I can wish away COVID-19. Well, not possible, but there are those that say, if I don't think about it, then it's not going to happen to me. Very magical, illogical thinking that is sometimes associated with anxiety. We don't say that as a judgment to the client, but it does let us know where we may need to work with them to help them overcome that anxiety. And also, this is where faith can kind of help, so that if the individual rightly has faith, then perhaps they can avoid the magical thinking. However, some clients with anxiety will engage in magical thinking and use the faith in magical ways. If I say a certain number of prayers, then COVID will go away or it won't be there. That's just magical thinking. So people can use religion and faith in irrational and unhelpful ways. So what we can say about anxiety is typically anxiety begins with a what if. What if I do contract, or what if I do test positive for COVID-19 and I contract the disease? It usually begins with that. Now, the what if is not what causes the anxiety. A lot of people do what if kinds of thinking. We might think of business people who sit around and brainstorm in marketing sessions, right? And about what strategy they should do. We have politicians who have groups that help them what if. What if, I am asked this question during the debate, what would be an appropriate response? So those brainstorms don't necessarily cause anxiety. It's usually the kind of thought that follows the what if. What if I do contract COVID-19? Then that would be terrible, horrible, awful, or I just couldn't understand that. So again, the underlying demand is that the threat must not happen, and if it does, that the individual would be unable to handle it. Okay. So part of the strategy then is, with a dysfunctional emotion, and remember, anxiety is a negative emotion, but it's a dysfunctional negative emotion, and we learned that the corollary to that would be concern. And so in this model, we would tend to debate or dispute the demand and then the derivatives. We're going to learn that later, but I want to point that out, that is the next step. That's what we do, in part, not in full, but in part. It would be a cognitive way to address anxiety. There are also behavioral and emotive ways. And so one of these ways would be to dispute the demand and dispute the derivatives, to show, for example, that the demand is not helpful. For example, we might say, how is it helpful for you to say that you absolutely must not get COVID? And COVID's all around you, and there is a possibility that you could get it. But how is it helpful for you to have this absolute demand that it must not happen? And eventually, clients typically realize not only is it not helpful, but it's actually contributing to the anxiety. And in COVID, the anxiety over a period of time can lower immunity and actually predispose someone to contract COVID. So in this way, anxiety would be dysfunctional. It was normal for someone to have the anxiety, but it's not helpful. And then we could look at the derivatives, the awfulizing, the frustration, intolerance, etc., etc. And then there are ways to deal with that. The other thing is, remember that each emotion, anxiety, has an action potential or behavioral potential, and it is avoidance. So that also gives us a behavioral intervention. We will talk about these in another session. It gives us a behavioral intervention. So this is what exposure therapy is about, is to help people overcome the avoidance. And when they do so, then because thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are interconnected, if we change one, we change the other. So if we have a behavioral intervention and the avoidance changes, often we will see changes in the cognition and changes in the emotion, which is a positive step forward. So just know that we will be covering what these disputes or debates are with the individual's dysfunctional thinking, and we'll look at how we can use the behavioral action potentials associated with an emotion to come up with the behavioral intervention. Okay. In this slide, I have a powerful example of the use of exposure, a behavioral intervention for anxiety. I'm not going to show that in this recording, but you will have access to this in Canvas. So I encourage you to take a look at this. It gives you an idea of what a behavioral intervention would look like. Now, the corollary helpful emotion to anxiety is concern. So we would say that is rational or a rational or a helpful alternative to anxiety. It too will have inference beliefs, action potentials, and some assumptions that are really helpful. So the inference here is going to be the same, and we're going to find this every time. Once we have a unhelpful negative emotion and the helpful alternative to that emotion, they are going to share the same inference. So that's important to know. The inference is not different. The inference is the same whether the resultant emotion is helpful or unhelpful. So the inference here is going to be the same as the inference for anxiety, that there is a threat to someone's personal domain, or in discomfort anxiety to one's comfort. Then however, the beliefs are different. Inference the same, but the beliefs are different. The beliefs will be functional. The individual doesn't want the threat to be there, but there's no reason that it shouldn't. That's a helpful, very helpful belief there to decrease anxiety. And so part of the treatment would be to help that client move to this more functional belief. And the other belief is, if the threat occurs, it's undesirable, maybe hugely undesirable, hugely unpleasant, but not terrible. But I would caution individuals with that because disputing that or debating that it's not terrible in the time of COVID or in a situation where someone has lost a child or a loved one is probably not helpful. It looks like a total lapse of empathy. And so what we want to help them see in such cases is while, you may have that thought that it's terrible, but how is it helpful for you to dwell on that thought over a long period of time? And most people realize that dwelling on that on an unhelpful thought is over a period of time is not helpful. So the more helpful belief is if the threat occurs, it would be undesirable, maybe hugely pleasant, but it is not going to be helpful for me to dwell on that over the long haul. The action potential is different than anxiety, where anxiety was the action potential, behavioral potential was avoidance. Here it is to confront the threat in helpful ways. And the assumption there is not that I am helpless in the face of the threat, but I can handle the threat. I may not be perfect, and I may not be successful, but there are things that I can do. And even with COVID, if we listen to the CDC, and not people who don't know what they're talking about, if we listen to the CDC and you wear a mask, you practice social distancing, you wash your hands, and you avoid large social gatherings, right? So if you follow that, then you decrease the risk and you can handle things a bit better, right? Let's switch to depression. Depression is an unhelpful negative emotion and normal, but largely unhelpful. And here we have kind of three types. And one would be like ego depression, that there's a loss of the self-worth. And that one's a very serious form of depression. If people believe that they have no value and no worth and no hope. Discomfort depression is if there's a loss to your comfort. Let's say you've just moved. I mean, I've been talking to some students who have to leave where they're living and move to another place right in the middle of the term. Well, that's uncomfortable. There's a lot of kerfuffle sometimes that's with that, and you have all the demands of school, and so it's uncomfortable to have to go through it. And that's not a loss to your self-worth to move from one apartment to another. So it's certainly not ego depression, but it could be discomfort depression. And then those are both about the self, but then there can be depression about what we would call other pity, that the person focuses on the loss of others and they believe that that loss should not occur, or it's horrible that the world permitted such kinds of loss. We're seeing this kind of depression in a large number of people. At the point of this recording, more than 204,000 people have died. So multiply that by, a certain factor, and we get a lot of people who are grieving, and if that grief becomes complicated, then they can go into other pity, and that would be a form of depression. Again, there is no negative evaluation of any individual that experiences any of these. Normal individuals experience these emotions. They're not helpful, and sometimes they need help, and sometimes they don't. But in those cases where they do need help, this is why we're covering this information. The inference with depression is, again, I've experienced a significant loss. It could be the loss of a job, a loss of friend, a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose. It could be loss, any number of losses, the loss of an individual, right? And the beliefs are usually a demand that I should not experience this loss, or should not have experienced, that it is terrible or unbearable. And then there is global negative rating. Global negative rating is that I'm no good, I'm a failure, I'm beyond redemption, I am hopeless. Those global negative evaluations, which are never helpful. And then sometimes global negative evaluation about the world and other people, the world for allowing this loss to occur, or other people. If there's a medical mistake, then a person may have a global negative evaluation or rating of the medical professionals who were involved in the case of their loved one. And so that global negative evaluation might be present. It might also be present in anger, as we see later. But sometimes, and let's correct this, many people, at least Freudian theory, thought that depression is just anger directed inward. There's no empirical evidence to support that whatsoever. There are individuals who, as they're improving in their depression, do get angry, but that may be because at the depth of the depression, they don't have the energy to be angry, and they're so beating up on the self. But once they do have energy, and that if that shifts to then global negative evaluation of the other or life in the world, then they may be quite angry. But depression is not anger directed inward. These are separate emotions. The action potential or behavioral potential associated with depression is not so much avoidance, but withdrawal from things that they that were previously reinforcing. That means they really enjoyed doing it. When they did it, they experienced pleasure, an elevation of dopamine or norepinephrine in the body, in that pleasure centers of the brain, right? And so, or they withdraw from people who they normally like to be around, friends, family, that kind of thing. So the action potential will be withdrawal, and so the theory would help us predict that. And of course, we always assess that in the case of the depression. The action potential would be that they're helpless to do anything to change their life situation, or the life situation is utterly hopeless. And once someone assesses, things in terms of helplessness and hopelessness, then we watch them fairly closely at that point. Okay. For depression, same thing. All of those dysfunctional beliefs we would debate or dispute, and I give some examples here. I'm not going to discuss it in this lecture because we will be discussing it in a future lecture. Okay. And again, I've given you a video on depression for more information about it. We'll not watch that video in this recording, but again, please watch that on Canvas. What about sadness, which is the rational or helpful alternative to depression? Now, those of you who have taken a course in diagnosis, psychopathology and diagnosis, know that the DSM-5 has as one of the necessary conditions, at least for adults, that the individual has to experience sadness over a period of 2 weeks. However, sadness and depression are not the same, and even though sadness is present, sadness alone will not get you a diagnosis of depression. You have to have 5 among 9 or 10 symptoms before you qualify for that, the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So there's a difference. And do not assume that sadness dialed up, if we intensify sadness, that we get depression. Remember, there is a qualitative difference between a functional and dysfunctional negative emotion, not a quantitative difference. So sadness can be quantitatively very intense, but it doesn't have the other dysfunctional features that we see with depression. The inference is the same, that I've experienced a significant major loss. The beliefs, however, are rational or helpful. For example, I didn't want this loss to occur, but there's no reason in the world why it shouldn't have occurred. It did. Things happen. Bad things happen. It's bad that it happened, but it doesn't negate all meaning, purpose, or potential future happiness. Okay? It may feel that way in the moment and even for a protracted period of time, but if we can begin to change that cognition, then we may get sadness to replace depression. The action or behavioral potential here is, although I've experienced a loss, I'm capable of engaging in some really constructive things, right? I can do those constructive things while sad. And then they would talk to other people rather than just withdraw from them, because withdrawing from things that are potentially pleasure giving just intensifies depression, right? So we don't see that one within sadness. So let's switch to anger, one of the more problematical emotions to treat, and we'll see why it can be difficult. In anger, and again, a lot of people are going to focus, they're going to say, but anger is so normal. All of these unhelpful negative emotions are normal. They're just not helpful. And we're going to make some distinction, because angry people like to lobby for their anger and think that everybody else is wrong rather than them, right? So that's why it can be rather challenging to treat it. What we see in terms of inferences that the individual seems to be blocked in attaining a goal that they desire, and that is frustrating. And so the inference is that they're being blocked. Another inference can be that another person or an organization, institution, whatever, has kind of transgressed some kind of non-moral rule of them. So it might be they have rules about police or rules about the medical profession or whatever. And if they make an inference that the police or medical profession, whomever, another person has transgressed that rule, then that will not cause anger, but it will certainly set the stage for anger. Remember, the inference doesn't cause the emotion, but it sets the stage for the emotion. Or that their self-esteem has been threatened by the actions of another person, institution, whatever. We see this often when someone goes to court and they get a conviction when they are holding that they are innocent. So that label of guilty is a huge hit to their self-esteem, and often the individual is going to be quite angry about that. The beliefs are that really kind of a demand that whomever, the individual or the institution, organization, should not have acted in the way that they did, and they're no good for having done so. So it is demand, and usually global negative other rating. So they make a global evaluation about the other individual or the institution. And in anger, the action or behavioral tendency is the opposite of what we see in anxiety and depression. The action potential here is to attack, either verbally or physically, the source of the frustration, whatever did the rule breaking, or whatever they interpreted as threatening their self-esteem. So the action potential is to move toward that. This is rather interesting because in the brain, those emotions that are in the right hemisphere are largely about avoidance. So depression, anxiety, etc. And so those would be largely negative emotions. On the left side of the brain, left hemisphere, we see the locus for emotions that are more positive, happiness, joy, etc. But anger is on that side of the brain too. Why? Because it shares a same action potential with joy and happiness. When we are joyful or happy about something, we move toward it. And the same thing with anger. So that makes kind of anger among the negative emotions different than most of the other negative emotions. In the other negative emotions, there tends to be some measure of avoidance or withdrawal, and anger is quite different there. The unhelpful belief is you must not act in that way or you're no good. And then we can dispute that, or we dispute the other beliefs. Okay, so here are some things to consider when you're thinking about anger, because I said it's a complicated emotion in many ways. Maybe not as complicated as hurt, but which is quite complicated. But anger is challenging, not conceptually, but in treatment challenging, because the individual who is angry about something, pardon me, I needed a drink. The individual who is angry tends to focus on something unhelpful. They tend to focus more on their anger being justified rather than whether the anger is helpful. And because they feel justified in their anger, often they don't even come in unless someone orders them to. The court orders them to, or the spouse or the children say, you got to get some help because you're just so angry. And why? Because they feel justified in their anger. The other people are the problem, not them. So when we treat somebody with anger, we'll talk about this later, when we're treating somebody who is angry, we need, they are used to individuals telling them that, they give them negative labels because of their anger when they're thinking they're justified. And so they're used to that kind of rejection or negative evaluation. So it's important that the therapist not negatively evaluate that individual. Now, that may be your first reaction because you're human, but it's not helpful when we're treating them. It's not helpful when we treat anybody to have a negative evaluation of them. But we're human and we will. So one of the things that we try to do is join them in their value. Well, what value? Often there's a value that they have about justice. Now, their sense of justice may be off, or they may be spot on in their sense of justice, right? For example, if somebody lies to them and they're really angry and they have a good value, that lying is unjust, we want to join them and say, yeah, I understand that value is quite important to you, quite good. But then the strategy is to show them that how they're going about responding to that slight of justice or the attack upon the justice is not helpful. It will not get them what they want. And so hold to the value. We want them to do that, but change the way that they go about addressing achieving that value, because the anger is not working. It drives people away, right? So the other thing is that a lot of times anger will have a short-term positive benefit. So an individual is angry and with someone, and the other person just kind of complies because they don't want to deal with the anger. Well, that's the problem of the second person. They have an irrational belief that they just can't stand that person's anger, and so they don't do anything to confront that anger. Or they may themselves have gotten angry and confronted it in a negative way, and that didn't work, and so they say, it's not helpful to confront it. And so, in fact, they reinforce, kind of complying with the individual's anger. So the individual erroneously believes that only their anger will cause a difference. You hear them say all the time, people don't take me seriously unless I get angry. That's not the case. They're taking you quite seriously, but they're thinking that you're being a jerk, right? And they just don't want to tolerate that, and maybe they think they can't stand it. But if they change and they realize they can tolerate it, then your anger is not going to work anymore. So better that you change your anger. Or it may be helpful in the short run, but in the long run, people go, I'm just not tolerating this anymore. So it leads to divorce or firing or something like that. So there may be some short-term perceived benefit, but in the long term, it doesn't work. And in fact, one of the techniques that we have is we have an anger episode record where we have the client analyze the anger in terms of the inferences, the cognitions, the event, the intensity of their anger, what they did during their anger, look at the short-term, long-term benefits of that anger and the short-term and long-term liabilities of that anger. So it's a really detailed process that we have the clients do. Anger also can be a gateway to another emotion, such as anxiety or hurt or depression. Sometimes when people are angry, they say and do things and then they experience guilt after that. So it can be a gateway emotion to guilt too. I have a YouTube clip that I just absolutely love. It's about a young man, Curtis, and it's a TV show that, from a few years ago where parents switch families, like maybe the mother of one family became the mother in another family. And we see how they try to implement rules and policies, and it often didn't go well. And so Curtis has received another mother. Curtis is down south, and and this woman that comes in as their, proxy mother, is into health food. Well, Curtis likes his bacon and canned cheese. And so this is fraught with some very interesting activating events. And you get to see Curtis at his absolute best with anger. This little guy, is just really adorable, and he is just furious. And so I'm having you take this information that we just looked about with anger, look at Curtis and kind of hypothesize what his unhelpful beliefs would be. And then for you, maybe even to think about what would you do? Because we just said somebody with anger just feels justified in their anger. What does Curtis feel justified? I mean, what does he think is the transgression, the unjust transgression that he has experienced? And then to that, you add these unhelpful beliefs, and you have an angry little boy here. Okay, very fun clip, and I think helpful for diagnostic purposes too. So there's the link to that one. And then what I would like for you to do, excuse me, once you watch Curtis in action, is kind of discuss, and even in class or in writing or in, in discussions, we can have you discuss Curtis. Clearly Curtis is an angry, angry little boy. And so what behaviors did he exhibit that are a tip-off that would be typical for anger? What beliefs do you think that he had? And then how might you respond? A little early for you to know that last one. So what is the alternative to the helpful or rational alternative to anger? It is annoyance. And a lot of people go, but that doesn't seem to be as intense as anger. And again, remember, the intensity is not the factor. It's the degree to which the emotion tends to sabotage us in reaching our goals. So we can be very, very annoyed, right? And that emotion can be quite powerful, but it's still functional because a person can attain their goals in the presence of that emotion. The inference is the same thing, that somebody kind of caused frustration, blocked them to attain their goal in some way. But the belief is different. I don't like your behavior, and I wish you hadn't have done that. We'll see if Curtis could get to this point. I don't like that behavior, and I wish that you hadn't acted that way. But you know what? There's no reason why you absolutely have to. You have free will, so you can, think what you want. And then the action behavioral tendency is the person doesn't just jump out of the situation, slam doors, punch holes in walls, scream and shout. They remain in the situation and they try to deal with it more constructively and assertively, and make appropriate requests. Assertively make request of the other person, knowing that their request doesn't guarantee a change in behavior. And then let's look at guilt, my favorite emotion, because that's my go-to emotional response for many things. The inference in guilt is that that the person, like that I have violated my moral code or my ethical code, and that makes me bad or sinful or irredeemably sinful, that kind of thing, if I'm really on a guilt roll there. The belief is that I should not have done that, or I should have done what I didn't do, and that I'm damnable or no good, or I'm deserving of punishment, that kind of thing. So it is a total kind of attack upon the self and global negative self-rating there. The action potential can be complicated. One, they may have unproductive attempts at righting the wrong. Some people just like give up, I had a parent that said something to the child that they didn't like. They felt very guilty. And so they started giving the child all kinds of freedoms that weren't helpful, and money and everything else, which just would reinforce the bad behavior on the part of of a child. If you do reward them that way, they're going to say, oh, let's see if we can induce guilt in my parent. Or they engage in self-flagellation, self-punishment. I had a client once who did something that she felt bad about and put herself down and went to her closet and cut up all of her best dresses. Sometimes people feel so guilty that they say, I can't stand that. I can't stand that feeling. And so they resort to unhelpful ways to anesthetize that. Drinking, drugs, even illicit sex, any number of things. Or they put themselves down so much they just don't want to take responsibility for it, and so they get defensive and blame the other rather than accepting the responsibility if they've done something wrong. Guilt is I can't imagine a situation where guilt is really helpful. Let me give an example of how it can be so dysfunctional. My specialty is, of course, treating PTSD, but also substance use disorder, because substance use disorder is co-occurring with trauma. And so what we see often is an individual, let's say if they're an alcoholic, and that's their substance use disorder focuses on alcohol. And so they're having this demand, I must not drink, I must not drink, I must not drink, I must not drink. Puts a lot of pressure on them, right? Rather than I'm going to do the best I can, may not be perfect, but I'm going to do the best I can to not drink and, to engage in sobriety. And then they slip, they fall off the wagon. And then what do? They often beat themselves up. I'm such a loser. I've really hurt other people's life. All of these kinds of things that are not helpful. And so they make themselves feel really, really bad. But what happens then? They feel so bad, and it's just almost unbearable for them. And they go, but there's one thing that always makes me feel better, and that's drinking. So experiencing the guilt and having themselves feel guilty is the first step for them to use again. So we always work very hard, particularly for addicts, not to go down that path of guilt, because it's almost because then we get this cyclical behavior of sobriety and falling off the wagon and using. Okay. I have a clip from a great movie from I think 1980, actually pretty old now. And I've given a link there, but I do want to have two caveats there. This is a scene of a young man who, a very negative event occurs that involves someone that he loves. And he's beating himself up on that. He feels tremendous guilt. And as a result, he attempted suicide. And now he's going to a therapist. And this is a breakthrough session for him. The therapist is not a second wave. It doesn't use second wave model at all. He's a bit more psychodynamic. But he does a good job with this kid in this particular point. The language is rough because the little boy is putting himself, the young man is putting himself down in really rough ways. And sometimes you're going to have clients whose language is not what we usually hear from a sermon. And so some of that profanity is that. And if you are, just say, I just choose not to be around profanity, I understand, and watching this video is certainly not a requirement. It won't negatively impact your grade in any way. The other one is because it deals with a very sensitive subject, that if discussions about suicide attempts or loss of a loved one would be triggering for you because of where you are at this point in your life, I would highly, highly recommend that you not watch this. Okay, and if you want, just tell me that you're not doing it, and I'm fine. Or just don't do it, and you don't have any need to explain that behavior for us. We're all on your side on that. Okay. So Conrad will be the main character for those of you who do this, and for anybody with guilt. The ultimate goal for someone with guilt is to help them unconditionally accept themselves. Not always like their behaviors and not always like some of their traits, but unconditionally accept themselves even in the presence of failures, bad behavior, and even traits about the self that are not great. Because the consequences of not doing that are huge and never really, really helpful. And people go, but and many Christians will believe in the fall. Well, okay, there's a difference between saying that, by my nature I may be a sinner, but to believe that that is the end of the story about you and overly identify with that is not going to be helpful. At some level, it would be nice if an individual, particularly if they are Christians, unconditionally accept themselves in the way that God unconditionally accepts them. Okay, so take a look at this. Unless you in light of those caveats, you decide not to watch that clip. Okay. What is the rational alternative or the helpful alternative to guilt? It would be remorse or sorrow. In the Bible, in Corinthians, Paul makes a distinction between godly grief and worldly grief. And when someone who's like in a second wave model hears that distinction, we kind of know exactly what they're talking about. And the way that he describes it, worldly grief leads to spiritual death. Paul says. And so that would be guilt. But godly grief leads to repentance that ends in salvation. Good consequences. So that would be more remorse. So even in REBT or CBT, remorse would be the emotion that we would want to help an individual come to rather than guilt, because remorse does not globally negative engage in global negative self-rating at all. Remorse doesn't, as guilt does. So the inference here is going to be the same as with guilt, that they violated a moral code or some value. But the beliefs are, I don't like what I did, but, I am a fallible, messed up human being, and sometimes I sin, and sometimes I do what's wrong, But that doesn't make me a thoroughly worthless, no good, bad person, okay? Not the global negative self-rating. And the action potential here is to take responsibility for what they did, apologize and repair to the degree that they can. Sometimes they cannot make amends or repair it, but do what you can. Even if it's a symbolic gesture, do what they can within reason, right? Without punishment and all of those unhelpful responses. Now for hurt. Hurt is fascinating emotion. It's not fun to experience by any means. The inference here is that someone acted, who's important to me. If they're insignificant, it doesn't matter. But if they're important to you, and they've acted unfairly toward you, and that you don't deserve it, that's the inference. They acted unfairly, and I didn't deserve that. That's going to be the inference for hurt. The belief is that the other absolutely should not have done that, right? And in such an unfair manner. And then it's terrible, unfair, etc. And this can go in two different ways, or you can flop between these two ways. One is more of a depressed hurt, and the other one is more of an angry hurt. The depressed hurt is usually what results if the individual believes I'm no good for being treated in this way, right? They're treating me this way because I'm no good. So global negative self-rating. So that would lead more to depression. But some people who are hurt don't go that way. They go, you're no good for treating me in this way. And so there's an angry hurt. So what we see in these cases, if it's a depressive hurt, they're going to have many of the same unhelpful beliefs that someone who is depressed would have. If they go toward an angry hurt, they will have many of the beliefs that someone who is angry has. Now, here's another dynamic, is that often an individual their first reaction would be kind of an angry hurt, right? But then they say and do things that are really bad, and then they beat themselves up for that, and then they move into a depressed hurt. So we can sometimes see that dynamic. And then the other belief is a demand that I must get what I deserve, right? The world must be fair, and I must always get what I want, what I deserve. Well, good luck with that one, right? The action potential is that we withdraw and we shut off communication channels. Or we engage in criticizing that other person, and sometimes we criticize them, we don't even tell them what it's about. So we feel hurt, we're sulking and all of that, and we criticize them, and then they say, well, what did I do? Well, you should know. Well, that's a grossly unproductive response or belief that other person should know. If they know, they know. If they don't know, they don't know. But if you put a should on that, then you're having a demand that is going to set you up for emotional disturbance. Or they choose a response that's designed to try to have the other person feel guilty. The hand on the forehead and the sigh first and then the utterance. That if you really cared about me, you would know what you did to hurt me, right? And they may actually believe that the other person should know. That's just magical, unhelpful thinking. Inducing guilt in the other person is usually not a really great strategy. I think a better strategy would be kind of, to develop alternative beliefs that are a bit more helpful and more mature. Or the individual, as I said, will respond in depressive or angry ways. And then here are the beliefs, they should not have treated me that. We've already gone through these. And then there are forms of disputing, but we will look at that when we cover the disputing or the debating of unhelpful or irrational beliefs. Okay. The alternative here is disappointment, and it can be intense disappointment, again, because the difference will be qualitative, not quantitative. The inference is going to be the same, that the other individual acted unfairly toward you, that a person of importance acted unfairly toward you, and that you don't deserve that. But the beliefs they have that yield disappointment are more rational and helpful. I prefer, I wish, I want to be treated fairly, but there's no absolute reason why others have to treat me fairly. It's not written in the universe, and they have free will. They can act any way they want, even in ways that are not fair. Okay. And being treated unfairly doesn't impact my worth or their worth. Being treated unfairly sometimes happens because the individual is not thinking about you. And simply because they treat you poorly doesn't mean anything about your value. It doesn't mean anything about you at all. Both of you are fallible human beings. The action potential in disappointment is that they act in ways that kind of increase the likelihood that they're going to be treated more fairly in the future. They communicate their disappointment, clearly communicate it. Don't, beat around the bush, but be really assertive and just straightforward with that and state that. However, we have to be cautious here. Let's say that the boss said or did something that you thought was grossly unfair and that you didn't deserve. Sometimes we may opt not to be assertive because in REBT, there's an overriding principle, and that is act in the way that is in your long-term best interest, and even short-term, but primarily in your long-term best interest. And sometimes a boss, if the boss is unreasonable and not emotionally stable, may get very angry if you are assertive with them. So you have to weigh it. I mean, if you really need the job and you don't have another alternative right now, and they're not hurting you physically or whatever, you may opt, to stick with the job until you can find a better alternative. I mean, if they're abusing you, that's a whole different story, right? But you have to, you don't have to, you can do anything you want here, but sometimes it's more helpful to weigh, given that other person and how they typically act, whether being assertive is going to help you in the long run or the short run, okay? That principle overweighs. Because it would be utterly irrational if someone said, I must always act assertively. Well, that's just another demand on yourself. That's a setup for an unhelpful negative emotion. Well, putting this all together is humorous. This is Wendy Dryden, one of the great theorists. Probably he is the most published author in the Western world right now. A great friend. In fact, I just talked to him this week, and I was telling him that I was going to be recording this and that I'm going to use his song that he wrote, and where he puts the ABCD model in song form. So I thought you might enjoy that. And then to get ready for the discussion about interventions, here's one fun one that kind of takes place in New York. And when I saw it, it gave me an idea for an intervention in New York. And I thought, I often think, wouldn't it be fun to see students on campus do this? It's called a shame attack. And when we get to shame attacks, I'll explain them a little bit more. But you can watch this. It's quite amusing. And then what I've done in this one, which is a Friday night, recording of a Friday Night Live, which is out at the Albert Ellis Institute. Way back in the 60s, Albert Ellis started Friday Night Lives, where he would allow people to come in off the street, and he would demonstrate the model in action. Two people, sequentially, one would come down, give their problem, and then he would demonstrate the model of how they could use REBT to help with that problem. And you can see the ABC model at play there. This one is a recording of Christine Doyle, who's the director of the Albert Ellis Institute. Wonderful woman, very, very accomplished. And she's doing a session, a demonstration with a young man who experienced anxiety. So really, really interesting. And I think it would be a preparation as we move into, in the upcoming weeks, how we do kind of a cognitive intervention, the dispute or debate of the irrational or unhelpful beliefs. So this one might be really helpful for you as you grasp the ABC model and as you prepare to look at how to do those cognitive disputes later on. Okay. Well, I thank you very much. And again, as always, if there are any questions, feel free to contact me using email through Canvas. Have a good day.